So when I made this, I print what was important on the back. But sadly, I used a gray background so it doesn't stick out as much. But in these three columns, I thought I'd go over the content with you while I was using the card. Um, in this first column is the mat. And I have the mat color coded with green exercises as beginners and blue exercises as intermediate and oh, I said it wrong. Yeah, I guess I did. Green beginner, um, intermediate blue, and red, red advanced, right? Um, and then in this middle column, so it's the mat, Joseph Pilates, and the idea, because I started out talking about Pilates being an idea. These look funny. And if you're not here to talk to, I don't need to worry about hearing you. Um, it took me a long time to figure out my view of Pilates and perhaps what I think is fundamental and essential about Pilates. And at first, it was an idea that I associated it with. Um, but this middle column and on this card, um, it starts off with Joseph Pilates, and three things from Joseph Pilates makes up my view of Pilates. That's from Joe's book and his definition that contrology is complete coordination of body, mind, and spirit. And that's right out of Joe's book, Return to Life, through contrology. And in the very next paragraph, after his definition, the sentence starts out, contrology develops the body uniformly. Now, in the book, comma, and then some other stuff, more of a sentence, but that's all you need from me to understand the means of pursuing contrology is to develop the body uniformly, right? And then the third thing, words, pictures, and films document the mat. So Joe's mat, 34 exercises. In that book, they're listed and described, and a whole bunch of other archival footage that Joe himself took, as well as two videos 10 years apart or 20, a long time apart of the mat, same exercises, same order, right? Nothing evolved or changed in Joe's time when it came to doing the mat. Now, Joe taught individuals what they needed to learn in order to get to the mat, if they ever could. And so the idea of Pilates evolving is there if you're considering what exercises you give to what people. But when it comes to Joe's mat, right, it's a song with different verses, and the song is complete as it is and solid as it is because it's ideal in nature. I think that's why I came to consider it an idea, because now in the second part of this column comes Michael Miller professes Pilates to be an idea. And how do I get to that? Well, gravity forces the issue of alignment. Gravity forces the issue of alignment. Sign language. My sign language has gotten more popular on my website. It seems that people with different languages are looking to bridge or use my sign language to help them explain what I'm talking about with Pilates. And one of the reasons that gravity forces the issue of alignment is because we are like a fish moving through air. See, we're made of water, we're heavy in air, and partially because of that weight, alignment matters a lot. And the great thing about Michael Miller Pilates is that alignment is sensational. You can feel it, right? How? Via tension between 2 points. 2 points. Yeah, it's been a while since I've read this. It takes tension to trigger fluorescence. And by fluorescence, I mean uniform engagement. I got knocked early on as though I'm saying that literally Pilates is fluorescent. And I'm just using the analogy of how a fluorescent tube works. You wire up electricity at 2 points of a tube filled with a particular kind of gas, and you get fluorescence within that tube, puts off light, right? The point being that in the human body, these axes of rotation are like endpoints of a fluorescent tube. And when you make rotation between them in opposite directions, because that's how the body is built, right? Oppositional rotation between axes creates tension and makes the engagement of the musculature that creates that tension uniform. Uniform development requires uniform usage. And see, that's where Joseph says contrology develops the body uniformly. Well, how does that happen? Well, when you understand about Cornu Tension, you understand how you are using Cornu Tension to engage the body uniformly, and from that comes uniform development. So uniform engagement produces uniform development, produces what used to be called Pilates body before someone thought that that was an inappropriate term and had no meaning. But when you see somebody that's definitely able to engage their body uniformly, and they've done it over a period of time, right? That uniform engagement develops the uniform body uniformly, and that's what a Pilates body is. So I say here that the idea of Pilates is apparent in the mat. Okay. And then I define the idea as uniform eccentric loading flowing through progressive patterns of movement. Okay. That's my definition. So I went from Joseph Pilates to Michael Miller to the definition. And now on this third column, I elaborate on the definition. Pretty good card, huh? Joe, Cornu's image, and the explanation of, and the mat listed by level, and then the three things from Joe that gets to Michael Miller's profession of Pilates being an idea. And the first word in the definition is uniform. And uniform means whole body. And if you've been around Pilates long enough, you know that whole body is one of the characteristics of what Pilates is supposed to be. It's a whole body effort. It's not Kentucky Fried Pilates. It's not pieces and parts. And then eccentric is the next word in the definition, and that means out from the center, to be eccentric, to have, to start at, oh, I've said this just recently too. To be eccentric, you have to start at ease. So the question on Facebook was about different reformers, and my comment was because to be eccentric, you have to start at ease. If you're on a reformer, you don't want to start in spring tension. You want the reformer to be at ease so you can start at ease. Okay? And so I leave you to evaluate reformers based on that insight. And then I say the true point of eccentricity is where? What's the true point of eccentricity? The true point of eccentricity between the hips and the shoulders is right there at the inflection point. It's where the curve changes direction. And gosh, where was I? I was in Brazil and I had a Portuguese translator, a young guy in college, and I started talking about inflection point. And all of a sudden, my simultaneous interpreter, translator, simultaneous, very, very skilled when you can talk in one language, hearing another language at the same time, and making the translation. Interpreter, a simultaneous interpreter. Precious, precious, precious people. Totally skilled. But my interpreter goes off, blah, 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 talking, and he looks down at me, over at me, and he says, my major is economics. I understand inflection points. So he was off and running on what an inflection point is. And if you've got a grip happening at the hips and a grip happening at the shoulders, and it creates tension, and that tension actually literally forces the two axes apart, right? That's where the eccentric comes from. Um, the eccentric, the stretching apart, happens at the inflection point, right? And the same thing is true between shoulders and ears. Opposite rotation between axes, you get lengthening between the two axes, and that lengthening happens at the inflection point. So, I don't know what they're teaching in Pilates these days, but knowing about the biomechanics of Cornu tension, and that Cornu tension is the means through which you get uniform engagement, and that uniform engagement is what develops the body uniformly, right? It's tough to beat that kind of understanding. Now, what about between the hips and the knees? We got a problem there because there's a bone that connects those two. So you get some of the Cornu tension between hips and knees and ankles and metatarsals, but the bones in between the axes, right, are connective and they're rigid. So they don't stretch as easily as it does at your waist and at your neck. Okay. So the next word out of the definition, uniform eccentric loading, is loading. And loading means weight bearing. To make any exercise harder. You know this already, right? To make any exercise harder, you add more weight or more load. Loading, weight, right? That's one way. That's the first way. So from the one leg stretch to the two leg stretch is loading because you're adding more weight, two legs instead of one. And then the next way is to move weight further away from center, right? So when Ramana added scissors, double leg lower lift, and elbow to knee. And then later on in the sequence, the mermaid side bend twist 1 and twist 2. They make sense. But they alter the fundamental structure of the mat. And having done the mat for decades now, I only do Joe's 34. Because it's not about making the 34 harder. It's not about making the mat harder, which was Romana's reason for adding those exercises. They fit, but they don't belong. And one of the reasons they fit is that you go single leg stretch, double leg stretch to scissors. Well, that's more weight further away from center, right? Makes it harder, right? And then the next way to make something harder is to decrease contact points. So when you do the corkscrew, you're on your back. But after the teaser, when you do hip circles, your shoulders are off of the mat, further away from center, fewer contact points. And there's other places in the mat that you can see this, but that's one of the ways that you make something harder is by decreasing contact points. The last way to make something harder is to change the tempo. Go faster or go slower. Stefan, one of my early instructors, was very fond of taking the whole method and making it go glacially slow, right? As a way of challenging. But when you know that, the way you make any exercise harder is more weight, further away from center, fewer contact points, and change of tempo, then you also know the way to make any exercise easier by going in the reverse direction. Change the tempo, increase the contact points, bring weight further toward the center, and then use less weight to begin with, right? So when you know how to make any exercise harder, you know how to make any exercise easier. And it matters less about where you start. Okay, now you got me rolling. On Facebook, some teacher in training is worried about what program to deliver the student. And what if you don't know the student? What if you don't know the background of the student, right? How are you supposed to design a program, a system, and have all that stuff figured out without having met the person? Well, when I was on tour, I would show up with to a studio after the first time, and the studio owner had lined up the people that she wanted to see how I would teach. And in the beginning, that teacher, usually female, sometimes male, would want to give me all the history of the student to help me be informed about what to do. And finally they would just say, I'm not going to give you the background because that doesn't matter to you because you teach based on what you see, not based on what you know, right? So when a person is waiting for their lesson with me and I see them in the chair waiting and they're like this, making a stretch in their body, a twist, right? Well, I know that the sequence, the pattern is flexion, extension, side bending, rotation, and torsion. But if they're there, and they're trying to deliver rotation to the body, then I say, come on, let's go. They sign to release, and they can get up out of their chair pain-free and walk over to a Cadillac without much problem. So based on what I'm seeing, I sit them down in the Cadillac and maybe do the saw on the Cadillac, which gives you the grip on the bar, the grip on the push-down bar, grip on the support bar, gives you stable stuff to make more twist with, right? So I feed the body what it was looking for when I showed up. And now the question is, right? The question is, what's next? And just like a piano where you can go up the keyboard or down the keyboard, you can choose to go up the pattern, flexion, extension, side bending, rotation, and torsion, or reverse the pattern, torsion, rotation, side bending. I got to get it right in my head. But from the saw, I might just as easily decide to go down the pattern. So flexion, rotation, flexion, extension, rotation. From the rotation, I might go to flexion. Except I'm saying it all wrong now. I'm a flexion, extension, rotation. So from the rotation, I might go to extension. And from extension, I might go to flexion. My point being that when you recognize the order of the pattern, when you pick an exercise within that pattern, you then can decide, well, am I going to go up the pattern or down the pattern? And to the extent that you're mirroring or miming or flowing within the pattern that exists within the method, to me, that's teaching Pilates. So it's not about an exacting routine of doing one thing, then the next, as much as what do you see with your client, and then respond to that and pick what's next with what seems to fit the pattern and also what you're witnessing in the body. Okay. So at one point when I was traveling a lot, I would teach in studios where there were training programs, and there was usually one or two or three or more trainees observing. And I would sign their observation hours because they were booking hours to get to the point where they had enough hours observing to someday certify. But I'd always ask a question about what they observed. And if they were really good observers, they would have questions. And they would always want to know why I went from one piece of apparatus to another. Why did you move from the Cadillac to the chair, and then from the chair to the ladder barrel, and then back to the Cadillac, and then onto the mat? I mean, there's no list on the wall for a particular apparatus that shows how to move between them, right? And of course, what they wanted to know was how I was making my decision, because I wasn't just following a list. I was looking at the body and observing how the body moved or didn't, and thought, now, how can I best address what I'm seeing or not seeing in the movement of the student, the client, the person in front of me? And that's truly what a person wants when they want to be able to teach Pilates. They want to know what to look for. They want to be able to recognize what to look for. and they want to have some sense of choosing what to do next based on what they're seeing, not just following a list. So this recording that was turned out sort of static has gotten pretty dynamic, but makes a really key point about being an instructor. And that's understanding how any exercise gets harder, more weight further away from center, fewer contact points, change in tension or tempo, right? I think I missed change in tension. Yeah, I wonder if that's on the card. Further away from center. It's not on the card. But see, change in tension or tempo, change in tension. A lovely lady, still a great friend of mine, um, struggling in her training program, couldn't do the short spine on the reformer because the reformer is done on these reformers with 2 medium springs. And that's the rule. That's the dogma. But the person standing in front of me expressing that frustration, right, is very pear-shaped in the body. And that means that her weight, right, is not evenly distributed in her trunk. She's heavier at her hips than she is at her shoulders. And because of that, springs do 2 things. They support load and they make alignment more perceptible. And so I said, get on the reformer. Right? She got on. And I added a spring. I added more support to handle the load of her body. And over and knees bent and come down. And I broke the rule. I broke the dogma. But I did so knowing what the issue was and allowed the body to achieve the effort, and in achieving the effort, refine the effort to where once things were better understood and more uniformly developed, that extra spring went away because it wasn't needed anymore. So a change in spring can make a world of difference in capability of performance. How about that? So we've talked about uniform, eccentric, and loading. I usually skip the flowing through and hit the progressive patterns of movement next. And you've already heard me mention those of flexion, extension, side bending, rotation, and torsion, right? And where does that come from? That comes from Joe's mat. Just go through Joe's mat and say, okay, is this about flexion, extension, rotation, or torsion? And you find that those patterns of movement exist within the mat, repeated like the verses of a song. I think the more you understand the structure, the more empowered you are as an instructor, and what you choose to do next with your student, right? And it's in my mind, so I'll share it with you. The number one goal of mine, when I'm teaching, is to have fun. Now that may sound outlandish, but if I don't have fun, I'm not coming back. And if your student doesn't have fun, they're not coming back. It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how much you know about their body and what it needs and this and that and all the snobby intellectual things that people can often lean into when they're discussing Pilates. It's got to be fun, right? It's got to be fun. One more story. I'm there with a guy I've worked with before who's a retired fighter pilot, no nonsense kind of guy, wiry kind of guy, and um, and he says to me, he says, I don't know if Pilates is really working. He's challenging he's questioning what he's doing, and I tell him, I said, there's an easy way to find out. And he looks at me like, yeah, what is that? And so I watched his face when I told him, just stop doing Pilates. And I watched his mind considering stopping because he'd been doing it for a while. He knew he could feel what he was getting out of it. So he wasn't really serious about whether or not it was working or not. I mean, he says, oh, no, I don't want to do that. So, the best thing about Pilates is it's sensational. You can feel it. With Cornu Tension, you can feel alignment, right? With the springs, you can feel load, meaning not as heavy or heavier. You can feel the tension that creates alignment. So what I'll say about progressive patterns of movement is that flexion is returning home or going back to base or going back to safety. When you're standing on a roof and you jump, you're not go arms and legs wide apart saying, oh my God, I hope I'm going to be okay. You go into a ball and tuck. You go back toward core, toward center, toward safety. And so flexion comes first because it's how you survive. And yet, right? And yet, something about life and living is an expansion out away from center, right? And that takes you into extension. And the odd thing, so I don't have any of my toys here. They're all in storage. A nautilus shell, right, grows and evolves out from center. But the human being had the audacity to grow a spine. And in growing the spine, its extension went so far, it was able to curl back the other way and rotate in an opposite direction. And this dynamic of rotation in opposite directions is what allows tension to occur, and not only tension, but eccentric pressure, because in engagement between the two axes, it forces the axes apart. Eccentric Pilates, right? And what took me off on that? Oh, the pattern. And so we don't live in just a singular plane. We live in 3D space. So after flexion and extension, we go side bending to explore the maximum range out of this plane, which is 90 degrees, right? Side bending, right? We explore and develop our capability in the lateral plane. And then, as if that's, see, if you're a robot, that would be one thing to get to move that simply. But in 3D, there's all the space in between this plane and this plane, and all of that range is covered in rotation. Okay. And then as the last pattern of movement is torsion, and where you can rotate your shoulders in one direction and rotate your ears in one direction. And when you rotate them in opposite direction, you get tension that presses the axes apart, tension that makes alignment sensational, Uh-huh. Um, but there's also tension between rotations along one axis, and that's had a name forever, which is torsion. So, how can I show this? So, this is rotation on the axis through the arms, but we're multifaceted capabilities. We can twist one way in one direction and the other way in the other direction. We can make torsion, right? And torsion is what allows the functionality of our limbs, meaning our legs and our arms, because we have major joints at knees and elbows. And it's this torsion working in opposite directions out a limb that gives the capability of control and dynamic support. The shoulder rotates the arm this way, but then the arm can counterpose that out to the elbow. But at the elbow, you can again do the same thing, create torsion between endpoints. The language of Michael Miller Pilates. The language of the biomechanics of Cornu Tension. And so, for as much as I love Pilates and it's been my passion my whole life, my biggest contribution from my pursuit of understanding Pilates is what I consider to be the discovery of Cornu Tension in the body, right? You go find that somewhere else, and I'll pack up my tent and pitch it under somebody else that's talked about this before me. But Cornu Tension comes from Michael Miller, and this image is trademarked, U.S. patent trademark, as the Michael Miller trademark. Not very trademarks, you see, issued to individuals instead of companies. But this trademark, registered around the world now, points to the biomechanics of Cornu Tension. And because the coils go in different directions, there's a equation in physics that when graphed looks like that, called the Cornu spiral. It's also called the Euler curve, right? And yet it's a static equation that strictly produces the image. And I'm working on an equation that would make the relationship between axes dynamic and include all 6 of them and not just 2 in the someday somebody way smarter than I am will come up with an equation that indicates the degree of Cornu tension in the body, the degree of uniform engagement. Because our target, bow and arrow, right? Our target is to develop the body uniformly. Joe says that's what contrology does. And Cornu tension is the way to get uniform engagement that produces the uniform development. At least that's the way I look at it. Now you can make of it whatever you want. Oh, and the part that I left out, flowing through. So flowing like waves, and then through. I got to be careful I move slow enough that I don't overwhelm my computer, because that's happened in the past. But flowing through progressive patterns of movement, But there has to be flow. And what do I say in the card? You have to press the flow to find the fusion. The fusion of what? Of being, thinking, and observing. That takes me off into my interpretation of Joe's definition. Joe says contrology is complete coordination of body, mind, and spirit. And spirit is often considered to be religious. But if Joe were alive today, I think he'd be very intrigued by and fascinated by the physics that we've come to know as quantum physics, and how things can appear to change at a distance and make that change faster than light. Spooky action at a distance is what Einstein calls it. But when Joe writes in his book about concentration and you have to be wholly concentrated on what you're doing, and if not, then your interest in Pilates is for naught, because this is the most important thing. Being, thinking, and observing are present participles, which means it's happening now. And what you're after in contrology, what you're after in Pilates, if you want the Pilates that means contrology, is you're after the experience. And the experience only happens in the moment, only now. I couldn't believe that Steele didn't have more to say in his book, and only mentioned Arthur Ashe and being in the zone as something that had some vague association of what doing the method was about. When, in my view, in Michael Miller Pilates, the contrology is a target. It's a target for the experience. And that experience is in the now. And being, thinking, and observing all are completely coordinated in the moment of the doing. See? That's where, as a Pilates instructor, you play the role of Yoda and you point into the cave of their experience, having them seek a sensation that they can then take more control of. Control, right? There is no higher calling, I don't think. There's no more exciting endeavor to engage in with another human being than to stand on the precipice of existence, of the universe, and feel the experience of being completely coordinated in your being, your thinking, and your observing. That's pretty present. That's pretty good. And if you can participate in that at all on your own, it's why you do it. And if you're in the privileged position of helping another person reach for that experience, nothing better. Now, it's dangerous. Not only they can get hurt, you can get hurt. So it's not a movement is a questionable thing. Questionable? Dangerous is more appropriate, I think. So you have to be careful. When in doubt, leave it out. In trying to pick what's next, you may look at a movement of the body and say, well, I really ought to go over here and do this with them, but I'm not sure. When in doubt, leave it out. There's so much to pick from. You don't have to be go out skating on thin ice, right? So pick something else. But I will say that if you go pick something else and whatever else you pick, you still get that feeling of, I really ought to try this other thing, but I'm not sure, right? When in doubt, leave it out when you can, perhaps. And when you can't, if you really are drawn to exploring this movement with a client, then go there, go really slow, and just in approaching it without even doing it, in my experience, sometimes a greater clarity comes from actually entertaining the idea of what you're doubtful about to where you get to a better notion of what to do. Okay? So any effort in Pilates can go south in an instant. And and that's why you should never teach Pilates unless you're insured. And you should be sure that whosever umbrella you're teaching under has their insurance as well. And why you never teach a student that has not signed a waiver, right? A waiver, because stuff happens. And it's part of the agreement you make with a person as their instructor to take the risk of the movement that you're seeking to improve or develop or control, as in contrology. So we covered a lot, and it's being recorded, so I'll be able to share this with my community, and those of you that know me well have heard it all before, and those of you who haven't heard it ever might find a jewel or two in what's presented. So life can't live forever. That's why I'm recording. Read between the lines. It's up to you to put two and two together, right? Look behind the curtain. That's what I've been missing lately. Look behind the curtain. See behind the curtain. Challenge what's going on and look beyond what's being presented to how it's being presented, how it's brought together. So live and live forever, read between the lines, see behind the curtain, add two and two. There may be another one in there, but I always end with the one word that in a good German dictionary means in one's mind's eye. And that word is Geist.